Hi everyone, so we are going to move on to our next chapter here. So we're going to be talking about different tissues that we're going to find in our body. So starting with the study of tissues is called histology. So that's going to be in a term that you're going to hear. So tissues are composed of similar cells organized into layers or groups with a common function. So all 50 to 100 trillion cells in our body are organized into 4 different types of tissues that we're going to be talking about. So the first is called epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve or nervous tissue. So these are the 4 different types of tissues that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to start with epithelial tissue. So the functions of epithelial tissue is for protection, secretion, absorption, and excretion. So it has free surface. So this free surface means that one side is exposed to the outside of a body or a body cavity. So it's really an opening to something else. So it has that free surface. On the underside, it is anchored to different types of connective tissue by a non-living layer called a basement membrane. So on one side, we have our free surface, which is open to the outside of the body or to a body cavity. And then we have our basement membrane, which is anchored to our connective tissue layer. So epithelial tissue is going to lack blood vessels. Cells are readily able to divide, and the cells are really tightly packed together. So with epithelial tissue, you're going to hear different types of classification terms. So these are going to include different shape terms. So our shape terms are going to include squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and transitional. So those are all words that are going to describe shape. And number of layers is another classification term that you're going to hear. So simple is equal to 1 layer. Stratified is 2 or more layers. And then pseudostratified is actually only 1 layer, but we're going to see the difference in a very specific tissue that we're going to be talking about. So when we're looking at our types of epithelial tissues, we're going to start with our most basic, so a simple squamous epithelial. So right here, this means 1 layer, and squamous means flat. So simple squamous epithelium, so that's going to tell you that it is 1 layer of cells, and those cells are in a flat shape. So if you look here, we can see we have our free surface over here, and this dark purple under here is our basement membrane. And you can just see that our simple squamous is very simple. You're going to be finding it in cheek cells. Any other example is like lung sometimes. So it's on those outside surfaces here. But remember, simple squamous means 1 layer and it's flat looking cells. So this is actually what you might see under a microscope, so a real picture that we're going to see under a microscope. These are cheek cells. Okay. So our next type of epithelial tissue is going to be simple cuboidal epithelial. So again, this is 1 layer, and cuboidal means cube-like. So if we look at these cells, we can see that we have a singular layer here, and each cell kind of looks like a square. So it's very, it's a little bit thicker than our squamous cells. So you can see here, we can see each cell with our nucleus and that square-like substance. So here our free space is in here, and our basement membrane is right around these cells. So this is what you would see under the microscope. So taking a look at this area right here, we have our free surface here, our basement membrane, and some of these simple cuboidal cells right here. Our next one is called simple columnar. So remember, simple means one layer. And columnar is going to be rectangular. So if you see these cells over here, you can see that there's only one layer of each, and there are these really long rectangular shapes here. Again, we'll see our free surface and our basement membrane. So this is what you would see under a microscope. It's a little bit harder to see, but if we look right here in this section, you can see that there's kind of long cells. Here's our free space, and our basement membrane is right around it like this. So there's individual long cells over here, which is our simple columnar. So our pseudo-stratified columnar cells here. So this is another one layer, rectangular shape here. And the difference between here is one thing you're going to see extra is we have cilia, which is kind of like hair-like structures that are going to come up off the end here. But also it's pseudo-stratified because you're going to see that these rectangular cells here can be at different lengths than all the other ones. So that's what makes it pseudo-stratified, because it's not just regular simple, they're not all the same size, but it is still one layer. And a good example of this is our respiratory tract. So if we can see here, we can see the cilia here, and we can see how these cells have different sizes. So what we're going to talk about next is stratified. So this is 2 or more layers. And remember that squamous means a flat cell. So we can see how we have a ton of layers on here. And you can see how these cells are mostly flat here. So a good example where we're going to see pseudo-stratified epithelial tissue is our skin. And again, we have our free space up here and a basement membrane. So it's kind of hard to see individual cells here, but you can see that we're a bunch of nucleus spread out over here, and that it's a large amount of layers. So that's something you would see under a microscope for stratified squamous epithelial. So stratified cuboidal, again, 2 or more layers. And cube-like. So you can see here our free space again. We have a basement membrane going around these, but we have these cube-like cells stacked up on top of each other. So as long as we really learn what the different classifications here, we should be able to predict what these are going to look like. So if we're looking under a microscope here, we can see these nucleus stacked up on top of each other with our free space here. So moving on to our next one, we have stratified. So again, 2 or more layers. And columnar is rectangular. And if we see here, more free space, we have our nice dark purple basement membrane and these long rectangular cells stacked up on top of each other. So if we're looking at a microscope slide here, you can see how these layers are stacked up on top of each other with these nice long rectangular shaped cells. And our last one that we're going to talk about is transitional epithelium. So transitional is really interesting because it's more talking about a stretch. So a good example of where you would find transitional epithelium is in our bladder. So you might hear that our bladder expands and shrinks. So in this case, when we are non-stretched, we're going to see kind of a bulky, larger cells here, but when we are stretched, it thins out. So this transitional epithelium is going to still have multiple layers here, but we can see that when it's not stretched, so not, we have a thicker area here, but when it is stretched, we have a thinner area. So it's going to kind of look like this flower-like structure when it's unstretched. And we can see that this thick layer here. So this is an unstretched transitional epithelium here. When we're talking about glandular epithelium, it's composed of cells that are specialized to produce and secrete substances into ducts or into body fluids. So there's different types of glands that we're going to talk about. So exocrine glands are glands that produce secretions that move by means of duct, and ducts are just different tubes in your body to open surfaces. So an example would be myocrine glands. They release excretions without losing cytoplasm. So myocrine secretions without losing cytoplasm. So an example of that would be our pancreas. Apocrine glands lose small portions of cell bodies during secretion. So a mammary gland would be an example of this. Holocrine glands release entire cells filled with secretion products. So that would be a sebaceous gland. So you can see the different types. So myocrine gland is just releasing the secretion here. Our apocrine gland releases a little bit of the cell. And then holocrine glands release entire cell products here. And we can see that these rapidly growing cells over here are going through mitosis to create more cells to replace the cells that are being lost with this secretion. So just to kind of talk about the different body organs that we're talking about here. So the pancreas is part of our digestive system. Mammary glands are used, usually breastfeeding is when that would occur. And then sebaceous glands are sweat glands that are found on our skin near our hair. Another type of glandular epithelium would be endocrine glands. So we just talked about exocrine glands. Now we're going to talk about endocrine glands. So these glands secrete products, so hormones usually, through tissue fluid or blood. So examples of these are going to be pituitary gland, which is found in our brain, and our testes and our ovaries. So this is where we're going to stop for right now. So we talked about all the different types of epithelial tissue that we see here. So remember that we are taking notes. If you would like a paper copy of the notes, feel free to ask me for that. Okay, I'll see you soon.